Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here for this last panel of the Racism Lab Symposium. My name is Deaweh Benson, and I am a doctoral student in developmental psychology here at the University of Michigan. And I am just so thrilled to be able to lead this discussion for our last panel of our symposium this year. And we have a great conversation in store for all of you. Today, we're taking a very deep look at structural racism. Entrenched historical legacies of racialized oppression and unmitigated anti-Black racism and modern policies contribute to detrimental health outcomes for Black people. Black people experience the onset of chronic illnesses and even death early in life. Economic and social stressors contribute to psychological distress, which further perpetuate alarming trends in mental health outcomes, such that suicide was the second leading cause of death among Black youth ages 15 to 24 in 2019. So this panel today is going to explore how a critical understanding of structural racism can help illuminate current societal conditions that contribute to poor mental and physical health among Black Americans. So when I'm using the term structural racism, I'm broadly referring to policies, institutional practices, and cultural norms that produce inequity based on one's race or ethnicity. And structural racism, it's an old problem that the field is just beginning to acknowledge, understand, and attempt to measure. And we're in really, really good hands today because our panelists are experts in investigations of racism and health. So for too long, structural racism has been invisible and unrecognized in analysis of social problems. And here we have Dr. Hedwig, who is a social demographer at Duke University dedicated to measuring the invisible. She takes a population-based approach to better measure and truly understand health inequality. One example from her broad portfolio is her work on the cardiovascular health consequences of having a family member incarcerated. We also have Dr. Enrique Neblett, who is one of the leading racism scholars with a particular focus on understanding how racism undermines the mental and physical health of Black youth. Dr. Neblett is a professor of health behavior and health education at the University of Michigan, whose interdisciplinary work urges academics to think critically about how institutional and cultural forms of structural racism shape outcomes across development. Dr. Neblett's research integrates psychology, biology, developmental science, and public health to examine how the interplay between youth sociocultural strengths and biological processes may contribute to youth being more vulnerable or protected from the harmful health effects of racism. We also have Dr. Nathaniel Harnett, who is a neuroscientist at the Harvard Medical School, who investigates neurobiological mechanisms that underlie susceptibility to trauma and stress-related disorders. His work has shown that structural inequities affect brain regions involved in PTSD development. And there have been far too far studies investigating racism and neural processes. So Dr. Harnett's work contends that neuroscience research must move beyond simply controlling for race and deeply consider how racism and the environment relates to the neurobiology of mental functioning. So what we're going to do in this panel today is we're going to kick off with a discussion with brief talks from each of our panelists. And we are going to begin with Dr. Lee. So with that, will transition. Dr. Lee, you can take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Deaweh, for that great introduction. I feel really honored to be presenting with the other guests today. And I'm about to share my screen, but I'm going to focus more on thinking about the measurement part of structural racism, and leave the other panelists to also talk through the biological mechanisms that are really important to consider as we think about how racism matters for health and well-being. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my slides, and if they can't, please say something. And I also wanted to thank you, Deaweh, again for organizing, and to just let you know, I know we should stay in the 15 minutes because I want to definitely have a robust conversation. So please just jump in and say you're over time. If that happens, it will not offend me. It's better on Zoom. You can't see the hand waving often. So I just want to make that clear. So a couple other things I want to mention. One is I should mention Maggie Hicken. Maggie Hicken is a longtime collaborator of mine, and the ideas that I'm going to share today are shared ideas that have been developed over many, I think now is it decades now, Maggie? I'm not sure, thinking about these issues. So I titled this presentation Restructure, and what I'm going to try to argue today very briefly, and hopefully we can have a conversation about this, is that as population health scholars, we really, this is the beginning of work in this area, but because we're at the beginning, I think it's really important that we right now start rethinking some of the ways that we are measuring or thinking about measuring structural racism in population health, just to make sure that that we're all on the same page in terms of thinking through the origins of racism, the kinds of research that we should be drawing from to understand what racism is, and using that to inform our measurement in meaningful ways. And so I'll explain that more as I go through this discussion. So as Deaweh mentioned, and I think it's important to reiterate, racism is not new. The study of racism, and here I'm talking about its structural, cultural, and systematic features, and I will give you some brief definitions, broad definitions to help orient us. I'm not saying these are the perfect definitions, but ways to think about things. The study of racism has been a huge area of inquiry in the humanities and social sciences for hundreds of years. And when I'm talking about the humanities, I'm not just talking about history, which is also considered a social science, depending on who you talk to. I'm talking about English. I'm talking about written testimonial slave narratives. I'm talking about philosophy. I'm talking about lots of other important work, fundamental work to how we understand and think about what racism is, specifically in the United States, but also globally, has been done for a long time. And so while the term racism might be sort of new, vocabulary in the population health field, that is not the case in these other disciplines. And it's really important to not only recognize that, but to actually read that work and make sure that it informs our thinking about how we measure and think about racism in population health. We cannot silo these things. There's so much to be learned from the work that has already been done and is currently being done on this topic. So when I'm talking about structural racism, this borrows from many different researchers and others, but I'm talking about the interrelated network of institutions, policies, and practices, as well as collective actions of populations, right? So you can't just blame this on institutions that favor certain racial groups over others. And it's important, oftentimes structural racism and terms and similar terms have been used also to, especially in the social sciences, have been used to help us move away from the idea that there are specific racial actors or racists that are the only people that are involved in what we think of as structural racism, and to help open our eyes to the fact that we all operate in a racialized system, as Eduardo Benito Silva says, and that the structures of our society, including institutions and the way we behave systematically, are done in ways that maintain a racial hierarchy that is historically founded, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Structural racism is just one term that we use. It's not the only term. And while I'm not going to say that these are all interchangeable per se, it's important to know there are other ways that people talk about structural racism, not using the vocabulary that's often used in population health. So I know there's work that has been done to differentiate institutional racism from structural racism, but also know that people use terms like systemic racism, racial regimes, racial violence, structural violence, which again, that has, some is more applicable to sort of thinking about global forms of violence, but also has been used when talking about what we often discuss in population health or structural racism. It's also key to understand that structural racism is closely tied, inextricably tied to cultural racism. We can think about this as our social and behavioral norms. These are ideologies and values that really premise the idea, and this can be implicit or explicit, that certain racialized groups are superior to other groups, and those that are racialized are less human and devalued, And this is done systematically through our practices and collective behaviors and actions. And again, there are many examples or other terms that have been used to sort of describe this idea, and none of these are necessarily mutually exclusive to structural racism. And by definition, they can't be, right? Because the culture holds up the structure and vice versa. But there are other terms that have been used to sort of explicate this. Are colorblind racism, laissez-faire racism, racecraft, the racial contract, racial ideology, the racial imaginary. The list continues. I mean, these are just some examples, and I'm putting them here just because I want us to really understand the robustness, nuance of the foundational work that has been people who've been thinking and writing about this again for centuries that inform what we're doing now. And so again, these are just some examples. And there's many intricacies here that I'm sort of glossing over, but we can talk about in the Q&A if that's helpful. So and this is work led by Maggie Hicken when I'm talking about this particular aspect of racism, but we can think about racism as having multiple features, and here are sort of 5 important features to consider when we're thinking about racism. I'm going to try to go through these briefly because I'm not keeping my time, but hopefully I'm okay. So one is this idea of ubiquitous adaptation. And so I have a picture here of chloroplast map and another map of the United States. And I'll tell you why in a second, but the idea here is that racism exists over time and place, and that there are, and while racism is everywhere, the way in which racism might manifest in certain areas, like certain counties in different parts of the country, example, or over time, might vary based on socio-political norms, et cetera. But there is always going to be a move towards returning to the status quo. So when certain kinds of actions that create racial inequality fall out of socio-political favors, other ones will emerge to maintain, the intent is to maintain the racial hierarchy that racism creates, right? So this is the idea. And the reason why I have this chloroplast map here is because, I mean, so what one argument could be is, instead of thinking about, one way to think about this is we could say, oh, counties might be different in the amounts of racism they have. Well, maybe that may not be the case. It could be the case that rather racism exists everywhere, it's just manifested in different kinds of ways. And I'm going to give you an example when I talk about this related feature of racism, which is a network structure. So the other idea that was mentioned before in the definition of structural racism is that we're talking about institutions that are networks and systems of institutions that are working together to create or maintain a racial hierarchy, right? And so here, the idea is that when one institution no longer works to maintain racial inequality, another one might step in to do that kind of work. Some really interesting work from somebody who presented at Racism Lab a couple years ago, David Cunningham, talks about this in the context of the post-civil rights movement in his work on enforcement networks. And what he shows is that in the South, you might argue that places that had higher presence of Ku Klux Klan members were places that were counties that were potentially more racist or had higher levels of racial violence. But in reality, what was happening in those places and spaces is that the Ku Klux Klan presence was higher in places where other systems, like the police system and other criminal justice administrators and actors, were not able to enact the racial violence and control needed to quell civil rights protests. And so it's really just a sort of this intricate interplay of networks, sort of are different actors within different institutions working together to perform the same, each with the same goal of quelling, civil rights protest movements, but in some places was more dependent upon the Ku Klux Klan, and in other places the police were doing that work. And so it's just another way to think about how we have to think about the complexity of racism. And so returning to this, so this is why I have this picture here, is because one thing that's really important to think about is when we're thinking about systems and different institutions, there might be different configurations of institutions at play across places that are actually doing the same thing. It just looks different, right? So I'm trying to be a little bit controversial here in this talk to spark conversation. Hopefully this will be helpful, but that's one of the things I'm trying to do here. Another aspect of racism that's important to consider is perceived neutrality. So lots of actions are considered race neutral, even though these actions are all working to create and maintain a racial inequality, right? So as many race scholars suggest, we are all racialized subjects, and everything that we do is within sort of a racialized system. And this is connected to this idea, second one, of historical amnesia. And so we can believe that actions are race neutral because we don't connect them to past historical patterns and processes. So here I have a quote from Eduardo Benito Silva, where he's talking about how we can consider individuals might say, oh, my choices for the neighborhoods I live in are non-racial. They're based on the fact that I want to live in safe neighborhoods that have good schools and great parks, et cetera. And it has nothing to do with race. But that, of course, is ignoring the fact that neighborhoods and the kinds of neighborhoods that are considered safe and are more or less policed and have more or less resources are based on a long history of policies and practices like Jim Crow, redlining, et cetera, that have led to the composition of neighborhoods now. And there are actually actions, I didn't finish this quote here, at play currently using other kinds of technologies to continue to maintain racial disparity, or racial segregation in these areas. And so even if someone might think that their actions are racially neutral, it's because they're disregarding this history that shapes many aspects of US society. And then the final feature of racism I want to talk about is this fundamental idea of devaluation of human worth. So if we're thinking about a hierarchy, that means that certain groups in the US, that's African Americans, Native and Indigenous populations, Latinx populations, et cetera, are devalued. They're considered less valuable than others. And therefore, actions can be taken that with that assumption and allows for certain groups to be disproportionately impacted. So sometimes there's lots of really interesting work in legal sphere, but we can think about also in work in the environment where outcomes will be racially disparate, but then there'll be discussions that the process or the judgments made to get to that point were non-racial, right? And again, this is problematic because it disallows for this understanding that we live in a society that is fundamentally grounded on certain groups being more valuable than others, right? Okay, and so, okay, what does this mean for how we measure structural racism? So I think it means a lot of things. One is, here I have another quote, and I can't read this whole thing, but this comes from Claudia Rankin, and she's talking about, in her op-ed, she's talking about the condition of Black life is one of mourning. And I just here she's talking about how, African Americans experience higher rates of mortality in terms of people they're connected to in a variety of ways, and give some examples from her own experiences. And then she ends it, which I think is interesting, kind of getting to this historical amnesia point that I made earlier about in terms of the dimensions of racism, that we live in a country where Americans assimilate corpses in their daily comings and goings. Dead Blacks are part of normal life here, dying in ship hulls, tossed into the Atlantic, hanging from trees, beaten, shot in churches, gunned down by the police, or warehoused in prisons. Historically, there is no quotidian without the enslaved, chained, or dead Black body to gaze upon, or to hear about, or to position a self against. And so I think it's really interesting and important that she's drawing on histories to understand how death can be normalized, like higher rates of mortality for certain groups is seen as something that is problematic to a group versus to a society, for example. But the question is, how do we measure this, right? Like we're population health scholars. Okay, Claudia Rankin is an English critical race scholar. How do we now operationalize this? I'm not gonna, just like spoiler alert, I'm not gonna tell you how, because I think that's what we're gonna talk about that in the Q&A. But I do want to mention a couple things. Right now, in population health, we've been measuring this by using measures of segregation, combining measures of inequality, sometimes creating structural racism indices, often at the state level, but now at other levels of geographic areas. Doing some work now with structural equation models and its analogs to try to think more about being even a little bit more complex about how different dimensions of racism here, maybe measures of mass incarceration, voting, segregation, et cetera, work together across different geographic units. And there's a call and some beginning work around systems modeling. And I think this is really important work that hopefully we can talk about more and how that then we can apply. So are we done? Yep. Did I already get 15 minutes? 2 more minutes?
Yeah, 2 more minutes.
Okay, dang. All right, good. I'm almost done. Okay. So 2 things I'll mention, I'll be done. One is we're population health scholars, but remember there's all these other people doing research in these areas, right? So when we're doing these when we're creating these measures, we have to remember there are people who've spent their whole life studying, racial inequality in the incarceration system. And, when we need to make sure that we have strong theoretical justification for what we're including in our measures and our indices, right? Because social scientists could say, well, how come you're not putting infant mortality disparities in your index measure, right? I mean, you put incarceration, that's the outcome I study. So why, how? I'm not saying we have good reasons to, but we need to be able to, what is it and how are we using this research to inform how we're doing this measure? And this is my last part. We do not want to become this researcher. I don't want to be this researcher, right? I don't want to be the person who's just like, let me just pick whatever, or the easy measures or the measures I think matter when I haven't really done the work to think about theory and the other kinds of research that really inform how we should be thinking about measuring racism. So I'll end here, don't be this person. Okay. And then in terms of moving forward, I'll save that for the Q&A. Thank you so much. And sorry I went over. See, I'm glad you just interrupted me.
Thank you so much, Hetty. I truly appreciated your just reminder for us to remember the vast amount of scholarship that already exists that we should be attending to, and lots for Q&A. But to switch gears, I will shift it over to Enrique.
Thank you. So I was saying, thanks for having me here. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon and honored to be on this panel. I am trained as a psychologist, as many of you know, and for us, thinking about issues of structural racism is kind of new, even though folks have been talking about this for a while. And I've also written, in some of my recent work in the last couple of years about how we need to be thinking more about structural levels of racism, but I'm questioning, how do we do that? And so really excited to be thinking about that. I think I'm in the earlier stages of thinking about that. And what do we do? So a couple of thoughts here. When Deaweh asked me to be a part of this, I said, I don't really have a formal talk, but I have a couple of guiding slides that I'll use to orient us and launch us into discussion. So just a little bit by way of background about my work, for those of you who aren't familiar. Over the last 15 to 20 years, we've been largely interested in this relationship between racism and health. I'm trained as a clinical psychologist and, was accordingly interested in mental health to start out. But towards the end of my graduate career in the early 2000s, I also started reading the physical or the racial health disparities literature outside of mental health service and utilization. And I was like, dang, these outcomes are really bad for Black folks. So I went to Howard University, where I did a postdoc in cardiovascular psychophysiology, looking at stress reactivity systems. And ever since that time, instead of thinking of myself as a mental health researcher, I've kind of broadened the lens. The other really important piece of the work that we've done is thinking about resilience in the context of racism and health. So we know that there's a link between discrimination and health. We know discrimination and racism is bad, but how do Black youth in particular kind of negotiate these experiences is a question we've been interested in. So we've looked at things like racial identity, individuals' sense of connectedness and belonging to being African-American. We've looked at racial socialization, how do Black parents talk to their kids about race, African cultural values, how do they mitigate against the impact of discrimination, so on and so forth. That's been the research program until very recently, when we've started to expand a little bit beyond just individual instances of racial discrimination. So to launch that discussion, here's a favorite quote of mine from one of my mentors, Dr. Jules Harrell at Howard. And Jules says, race relations and interpersonal dynamics that take place in a modern racist system are but a small corner of the total picture. They act like the clown at the circus. They're not totally unimportant, but they should never command our full attention. This is what I had been paying attention to as a psychologist, the individual factors, discrimination. Jules says we should not see them as primary causal agents. I think it's wise to take very seriously the distinctions Jones makes. Here she's referring to James Jones's tripartite model of racism between racism and prejudice, along with his taxonomy of the types of racism. In so doing, we may avoid focusing on the clown, the racial discrimination, while neglecting more important activities taking place in the center ring. As Dr. Lee has alluded to, and even though folks would have us to believe that structural racism was invented in 2019, folks have been talking about paying attention to things that go beyond that individual level for a long time. Another one of my favorite models related to thinking about this work is modeled by David Williams and Selena Mohammed, which really helped us to think about, this is a little later, 2013, of course, lots of work well before this period, thinking about racism and the pathways, the mechanisms by which we get from the institutional and cultural racism to health outcomes. Here I've circled some of the particular boxes that we've investigated in our own research, but this is complex, right? There are lots of different pathways. One of the things that was particularly exciting about this conceptual model is that Williams and Mohammed said, look, similar to what Harrell's quote alludes to, really we've got to pay more attention to the institutional and cultural factors. And in fact, if you look at racial discrimination, you see that's a proximal pathway here in the middle of the model. And this kind of, had required a pivot for me because for a long time, the research that I was doing was really focusing on racial discrimination. And now here's this, kind of, conceptual model saying, oh, that's way downstream. What we need to look at is kind of these institutional cultural factors. And by the way, these are not things that psychologists have typically measured or known what to do with. So before I talk about a recent study that we've just begun, this is a conceptual model I worked on with a couple of colleagues recently. It was published in Annal Review of Developmental Psychology, really thinking about how we get at structural racism and its effects developmentally over time. And you see the familial and community assets, again, thinking about this resilience piece. I kind of chuckled as I was preparing for this presentation today, because when I looked at the model, I thought to myself, I don't know if I agree with the model. I'm like, wait a minute, structural systemic racism, is that really distinct from cultural racism? And then some of the examples that we had for cultural racism, I'm like, I'm not sure. And then even as I heard Dr. Lee presenting and showing the definition of cultural racism, I thought, wow, there's so many different definitions of these things. So you'll hear me talk about cultural racism in just a second in ways that are related to what Dr. Lee said, but that are different from the definition that she showed you. And so this kind of reiterates the point and leads us, I think, to exciting discussion that maybe no two racism researchers agree on the exact definition of what constitutes structural racism. Despite this figure here, which I'm a co-author on, I tend to think of cultural racism as being a part of structural racism and not something that's separate from. So, it's hard to get the pictures and figures perfect. And we had lots of discussion about how they should be represented. But ultimately, we settled on this figure here. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about a project I'm working on with a couple of collaborators here in psychology and ISR on structural racism and mental health. This is a project that was funded as one of the structural racism and health grants that NIH had a call for, I guess 2 years ago now. What they said is we want folks to do more than what I was doing and focusing on individual racism. And so it was a really nice opportunity for me to step out of psychology and look at how other people were measuring these things, some of which Dr. Lee has alluded to. So even though folks define structural racism as, the policies and practices, there are relatively fewer studies that actually look at actual policies and practices. A lot of the measures are things like what you see here, people looking at Black-white disparities in a number of social determinants of health, like employment, education, et cetera. People have talked about these as proxy measures of structural racism, but have said they're not racism itself. And there's been some contention and arguing about, are we measuring, kind of the products of structural racism or structural racism when we look at these proxy measures. Some key kind of measures, again, I think we saw some of these in Dr. Lee's talk. Folks have looked at racial segregation, criminal justice, incarceration, immigration policy. You hear people talk a lot about cultural racism and cultural representations, but how we actually do and measure that is a topic that we're very interested in our project, but that I'm not sure folks have agree on how you do that just yet. So in doing this work, a couple of things that oriented this particular research project: how do we go beyond the neighborhood? Again, Dr. Lee alluded to sort of looking at state and county level measures. How do we go beyond zip codes and census tracts, which have some limitations? And there's some work beginning to think about, look, the effects of structural racism can be developmental, particularly as we think about these biological mechanisms. How do these earlier exposures kind of change brain function and structure, for example? How do they implicate stress reactivity systems? We know that autonomic reactivity is linked with a number of health outcomes, tumor progression, and other sort of immune function. And so beginning to think about these things over time. One of the limitations and why we wanted to focus on mental health in our grant, we debated when we were writing it, is that there really weren't a lot of studies looking at mental health proper. So you have a number of studies that are self-reported mental health, but the overwhelming majority tend to be morbidity and other things that we think of in the physical health space. How do we look at multiple domains of structural racism? How do we get beyond kind of these self-report measures and cross-sectional data is kind of what informed our project. So this is actually my last slide here that shows you our working conceptual model, this big picture of what we said we're going to look at in our study. By way of quick background, we're using data from Future of Families, formerly Fragile Families data set. So this is a birth cohort, longitudinal kids, as many of you may be familiar with, born a little bit before the turn of century into 2000, who are now young adults. And so we're trying to piece together these data that have been collected from a subset of the families to understand how structural racism leads to mental health. And consistent with prior work that we've done, we're looking at the physiological mechanisms by which that occurs. And notice here that we're looking at multiple physiological systems. So my particular area of interest is the autonomic nervous system and stress reactivity. But we're working with my colleagues, Luke Hyde and Chris Monk, who have the expertise in neurophysiology, who are thinking about the brain mechanisms by which some of these things may occur. One of the things that people have talked about is perceived threat appraisals, and how some of the negative representations that people may have as a result of racism might actually lead to changes in executive functioning and physiological mechanisms that have to do with planning that are compromised when you perceive threat. So those are some of the things we're thinking about, in addition to inflammatory markers. Again, most of this work people are kind of talking about conceptually in terms of individual stuff, and so we are trying to look at it again at a structural level. The last 2 minutes I want to mention here are focusing on cultural representation. So we're like, how do we do this? In our proposal, we said, look, we're going to take some data from the Southern Poverty Law Center that has information on Confederate statues and Confederate markers. We're thinking about cultural racism in the context of images and ideas. And we said one thing we could do was look at how close people are, physical proximity to statues. We might look at the density of statues and other cultural markers as they relate, in this case, to mental health. So happy to talk a little bit more about that. As Dr. Lee alluded to, there are lots of potential confounds and things that are covariant, particularly most of the Confederate statues are in the South, but we're collecting some data in places that are not former Confederate states to try to tease apart, cultural racism. But there are lots of things that co-vary with it that are structural. So thinking about how to do that is a challenge. The last thing I'll mention is some exciting conversation we've been having with a psychologist here at Michigan, Monique Ward, who's thinking about media and expanding cultural representation. So in our grant, we said we're going to look at these statues, but we're thinking about exposure to media, TV programming. Could we code sort of representations of inferiority or superiority of Blacks and whites in TV programming, books, in the advertising that people are exposed to, so on and so forth. So I'll just leave that as a tease and food for thought, and look forward to talking with you more about the cultural racism and whatever else you're interested in as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neblett. That I think, honestly, the way you shared the development of your research trajectory over time and the way your focus, how it's shifted from individual level discrimination to focusing on the structural. One thing in that, I just appreciate you sharing that, but also I think that calls out some of the limitations of us operating in individual silos in our discipline. So thank you for getting us into that. But I will now shift gears to our last presenter. So Dr. Harnett, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully everyone can see the screen. I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm a little nervous in terms of following Dr. Lee and Dr. Neblett, but we'll do our best and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to shift a little bit from what we've been talking about and focus a little bit more on neurobiology. And I will say that I will do maybe the thing that we're not supposed to do and focus more on inequities instead of calling it structural racism. Because I think, to the point that Dr. Neblett made, in neuroscience, we're a little bit earlier in trying to get actual measures of structural racism as opposed to the outcomes of that. But we can have that conversation sort of as we get to the panel discussion. I think that'd be interesting. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the neural circuitry of threat, because the work that we do is really about trying to understand why people develop trauma and stress-related disorders. We focused mostly on how people learn to fear different things. We do this usually by looking at something called Pavlovian fear conditioning, sometimes called classical conditioning, as people learn the association between a previously innocuous cue and an innately aversive stimulus. They develop this learned association that helps them predict that a threat is about to occur. And through many, many years of animal model work and human model work, we've gotten a really good understanding of what we think the core neural circuitry is that's involved in sort of this threat processing that's really centered around the amygdala, hippocampus, and different components of the prefrontal cortex. As a basic overview, what we really think happens is that the amygdala is key for actually forming the association between cues in the environment that predict a subsequent threat and the threat itself. And that information is then sent to downstream effective brain regions like the brainstem and hypothalamus to elicit things like peripheral expression of the emotional response. This includes things like changes in heart rate, eye blink startle, or changes in skin conductance or sweat activity in the palms of the hands. You can imagine if you're giving a talk, you got a lot of eyes on you, you might start to feel nervous. That's the type of thing that we're talking about with skin conductance. The hippocampus is important for contextual modulation of associated threat memories. So if you form an association between the hiss of a snake and the bite of a snake, and you're out in the woods and you hear the hiss, that's a different context than if you're sitting on the couch watching Animal Planet. And then different components of the prefrontal cortex help to support threat detection and appraisal and attention, and then have direct connections to the amygdala to help modulate the amygdala response, either to exacerbate it or to inhibit it. And through a lot of the work that we've done over the last several years has been about trying to image this circuitry early after a traumatic event and see if it's predictive of how people go on to develop PTSD symptoms or not after that traumatic event. And we've had some pretty good success in this. Early work by Jenny Stevens at Emory University has shown that amygdala reactivity to emotional stimuli and BMPFC habituation to that stimuli is associated with either early expression of PTSD symptoms or even expression of PTSD symptoms up to a year later. We've shown that structural integrity of the white matter tracts that help to interconnect these individual brain regions are also associated with future PTSD symptoms. And similar, the way that these brain regions are functionally connected, how they sort of talk to one another, is also associated with future expression of PTSD symptoms. One of the things, though, that we know is that these same threat circuitry regions are affected by a lot of the experiences that we have early on in development and can affect how these brain regions respond to subsequent stimuli. One of the most prominent ways we've looked at this is through looking at things like adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And these are things that have really pronounced impacts on physical, mental, emotional, and behavioral development. They're pretty well experienced, or pretty highly experienced by most of the population, with at least 50% experience at least one ACE in their lifetime. And this can run the gambit of different things, including abuse and neglect, witnessing community violence, growing up around a lack of resources, or growing up around things like substance abuse. I think that's been pretty well appreciated across the spectrum of research. One thing in neuroscience that I think hasn't been well appreciated is the fact that a lot of the exposure to these ACEs are highly racialized. So this is data from childtrends.org looking at the percentage of children with one ACE or two or more ACEs. And regardless of what region of the United States you're looking at, you really see these clear inequities between racially and ethnically marginalized or more minoritized groups and white non-Hispanic individuals, where these sort of marginalized and minoritized groups are just exposed to more ACEs overall, which may have an impact on how that sort of threat neurocircuitry might develop. It's also, I think, critical, has been already raised, to consider the ways in which socio-historical pressures have shaped the environments that people are growing up in, and how that might also have an impact on the developing brain and how people respond to threat. So on the left is data that people might have seen before, but this is the area deprivation index. It's a way of quantifying the relative advantage or disadvantage or amount of resources within a particular area. And one of the regions I like to show is Baltimore, which has a very clear history of redlining. And you can compare that to an area like Bethesda, where a lot of us apply for grants to the NIH. You can see that Baltimore very highly disadvantaged in certain areas, Bethesda very highly advantaged. And if you plot that against US Census data, you can sort of see the historical remnants of what's happened, where a lot of individuals or a lot of counties that are predominantly Black also happen to be primarily disadvantaged. It's not a one-to-one ratio, but it's important to keep this in mind as we sort of do these types of studies and try to understand, what is actually happening in terms of geographic influences on neurobiology. As another example of this that I think is very clear, we had done some studies that I'll talk about where we collected data from Birmingham, Alabama. If you know anything about Birmingham, Alabama, there's very clear sort of racialized history of the area. And if you look in terms of disadvantage and racial segregation, there's a very clear north-south difference between them. So all of these things are things that we've been starting to think about in terms of how might this contribute to differential development and expression of threat between Black and white individuals, and how that might be tied to social and historical processes that we want to start to take a look at. So we've known for a long time that by not taking into account sort of the racial biases and how we're collecting and looking at data, this is a really big output on the sort of science that we can do, whether that be through sort of machine learning or AI approaches. We've known for a long time in terms of genome-wide association studies, trying to get at an understanding of the genetic or molecular basis of traits or behaviors, that we do a really good job of sampling people from European ancestry, even though that's not representative of the global population. And when your samples in terms of neuroimaging are appropriately representative of the population you're trying to look at, you get differential brain patterns of development over time. So our actual understanding of the trajectory of development for brain regions is skewed by whether or not our populations or samples are actually diverse and representative. So in some of the early work that we've been doing over the last several years, been really trying to plot what might be happening as a result of some of these different inequities that we've been talking about in terms of both development of threat neurocircuitry and how that neurocircuitry actually responds to aversive events. In some work done by Natalie DeMornay, who's now at the University of Minnesota, she looked at data from the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study, which is this huge longitudinal study of kids that start when they were 9 to 10 years old. I think they might be 15 to 16 now, but don't quote me on that. They'll be followed for another several years. But what she looked at was whether or not there are any differences in gray matter volume between white and Black individuals. And I should note at the start, the first thing we actually did when looking at this was try to assess a number of different proxies of early life adversity, whether that be sort of parental income or, again, aspects of area deprivation or neighborhood disadvantage, the amount of conflict in the home, things of that nature. And what you see sort of right off the bat are these differences that are not entirely large between white and Black kids in the sample in regions such as the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and hippocampus. But once Natalie did some mediation models to see, how is the sort of adversity differences between these groups contributing to these race-related effects, she really sees this attenuation of the effects of race on brain regions like the prefrontal cortex, accounting for up to about 50% of the variance in about 9 and 10-year-old kids using some very coarse metrics of adversity. In some additional work that we had done at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, using data from the Healthy Passages study, which had followed a selection of individuals from when they're about in 8th grade up through about 23 years old, and we had done neuroimaging from about 18 to 23, we looked at how individuals were responding to aversive threat. How were they responding during that fear conditioning task that I talked about before? And we see these very clear differences on the top row in terms of just overall reactivity to threat between white and Black individuals, where white individuals just show more reactivity compared to Black individuals, and Black individuals seem to show this neurophysiological blunting or less responsiveness to the aversive threat. But again, much like Natalie, once you actually take into account the sort of inequities that these individuals have been exposed to, that these inequities between the groups, you really attenuate just about all the differences in how these individuals are responding. And so really, even though the effects in 9 to 10-year-olds are relatively small, we see much larger effects in young adults. What we really think we might be seeing here is a sort of potential growth of inequities or racism-related effects on that threat neurocircuitry over time, such that as we leave individuals in environments that are highly deleterious, highly adverse, we might see sort of a largening of the gap between white and Black individuals that, again, really is due to the inequities that we expose them to. I think, though, that it's also important to keep in mind what's happening at sort of an individual level. So this is work that I've been a part of, but I'm not responsible for, but this is work led largely by Nagar Fani at Emory University and Sierra Carter at Georgia State University. And they've been looking at the effects of racial discrimination on trauma-exposed Black women, how that's associated with differential brain function and differential brain structure. One of the first things that they saw was they had Black women complete this sort of emotional conflict task where they have to do it, essentially the Stroop task, but they're pre-exposed to either trauma images or neutral images, so negative or neutral. And one of the things that they saw was that within activity within the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, that brain region really important for emotion regulation, they see this positive association between responses in that region and endorsement of racial discrimination across their lifetime. It's also associated greater racial discrimination, that is, with actual better performance on the task. I think this sort of threw people at the start, but it makes a lot of sense in that if you have individuals, particularly in Atlanta, Georgia, who are exposed to a lot of structural inequity, a lot of other adverse experiences, a high polytrauma group, and then they also have to deal with sort of the interpersonal aspects of discrimination, you still have to survive. You still have to put up with it. You still have to go to work. You still have to put food on the table. And so you get really good at drowning out that less important information for your survival when you still have to do all these other things. But one of the things that they also saw was that there's this sort of lower gray matter volume within that same brain region, that's associated with racial discrimination. They also see that there's this association between white matter microstructure, the actual structural integrity of these brain regions, in those who have greater racial discrimination. And it's this association between discrimination and white matter microstructure that's also contributing to greater health problems as a result of more racial discrimination. So even though these individuals are performing better on this task, the sort of greater exposure to racism is actually associated with worsened structure and contributing to more health problems. So I think that as the final thing to touch on, why this is so important for us to think about in terms of how do we predict PTSD, we've done a recent study showing that if you look at recent trauma victims, both Black, white, Hispanic, you see these differences in amygdala connectivity to things like the salience network. So dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this differential connectivity pattern is actually associated with differential prediction of PTSD within these individuals. So failing to take into account the differential exposure to inequities is actually having a direct impact on our ability to use this brain data to understand who's going to be susceptible to PTSD. And so I think that gets to the end of my time. So I just want to summarize very quickly. I think neuroimaging is really cool and important. It can tell us a little bit about PTSD susceptibility, but I think we in neuroscience really need to move towards really understanding the intersection of the racialization of prior life events and structural racism to really understand how we're going to be able to deploy this to the most number of people and make it really effective, develop generalizable neurobiological models of disorders. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nate. That just for highlighting that adversity is racialized and just calling out the way in which this racism in the environment over time that has developmental implications. So there's so much to go from, but we'll transition into questions. I'll kick off with a few questions that I have, but for the audience, you can feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we'll get to your questions as well. But I'll start with the first question, and it's just a broad question to just generally get a sense of your perspectives on the state of research on structural racism. If you could share one exciting aspect on the state of research today and maybe one disappointing aspect of the state of research today. We will start with Hedwig.
Thanks. I mean, I should say that in general, I'm really excited that we are talking about racism in population health and that we are centering it in work. And so for me, that's really exciting and important. I think the other speakers talked about this as well, that it's been a long time coming. As we know, there's been research in this topic and writing about this work for a very, very long time. And in the past, different language had to be used to even talk about things that are manifestations of racism. So I'll say for me, it's just exciting that this is part of the conversation and that we're interrogating and doing this kind of work. And as I mentioned before, I think there's nothing I want to call out per se. I just think it's important that we really think critically about the work that has been done to help us to understand what we are measuring. To really need to think about measurement and modeling too. I think when we're talking about structural racism, it's not just the components, but it's the features and how institutions and collective actions work together to create inequality. And so that requires not just thinking about what goes into the measure, but what, like, the dynamism of the measure, et cetera. So I think that's important too. And then lastly, I'll just say, and I didn't get to do this to go to my last slide, but even if not everyone is going to be, measures are only going to proxy. That's, we all know that there's no such thing as the perfect measure. We proxy how we understand the world to work. But even for those who aren't going to attempt to create a measure of structural racism, which we can still think about the work we're doing with the frame of racism and understanding how what we're measuring is a manifestation of racism. I think it could help even how we interpret results and think through the implications of our work, to realize it's just one piece of the puzzle, maybe more. So that would be my comments.
Thank you. And anyone else, feel free to jump in.
I mean, I largely
Oh, it looks like you're still muted, Enrique.
still muted.
I can hear him.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, I largely agree. I'm glad we're having the conversation. I mean, this was something that we weren't talking about in terms of the measurement piece. So excited we're having the conversation, excited people think this is important and it's getting the attention it is. I think some of the challenges continue to be all the different ways that people are thinking about it. And sometimes it's hard from a measurement perspective when there are all these different definitions. And you're not going to get everyone to agree. But I think maybe taking a step out and realizing like there are different ways of talking about these things is helpful. And maybe the end goal shouldn't be that, we all agree on what, the definition is or the term is, but recognizing the strengths and limitations of different definitions and different ways of thinking, and that will evolve with time. I think the other frustrating piece for me, I'm thinking about cultural racism and mental health. And yes, I want to document and understand that, there is a link between the two. Otherwise, people will question whether that's the case. But I feel like it takes time away from the important work of addressing the underlying structures that are causing the problems in the first place. So, and thinking about interventions and what we do and structural interventions, how do we think, like, what is a cultural level intervention? What are structural interventions? How do we get to those things that are racializing the adverse experiences that Dr. Harnett mentioned, for example? So that's my quick response.
I think if I can just jump in at the end, I think that it's exciting to see sort of, at least in the neuroscience end, an explosion of interest in the topic and trying to understand the ways in which we have probably collapsed over very important variants in the work that we do, and that a lot of us have said that there's stress and that affects everyone, as opposed to really thinking about how the societies we've built and how the structures we have and the sort of interpersonal dynamics might differentially impact certain people. I think the frustrating thing for me and sort of where I list is that a lot of us who are in this field, me included, don't have the type of training that allow us, I think, to take full advantage of the work that's been done before. And so I think part of what I'm excited about, to sort of do the compliment sandwich thing, is to actually get some of the input and hear the criticism of what we need to be doing, especially on our end, to make this work the most impactful that it can be.
Good. I think a couple, just build off of that. I think the other question I have is just, what do you think are the limitations of your individual disciplines in doing investigations of structural racism? And it could be, you could be as critical as you want to be.
I think I just going, like talking, bouncing off of what Dr. Harnett said, I guess I would say, some of this is structural in terms of, how we're incentivized as researchers and what we need to be able to get promoted, et cetera. And so lots of, because true interdisciplinary training is like a capital T all the way, right? Because I think a lot of times when we talk about interdisciplinary training, we're saying like, oh, I've dabbled in XYZ and did a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but I'm still mainly, a sociologist, for example. And again, like the way that our institutions are structured, it almost necessitates that, because people, you need to publish in the top journals that are like in your area, et cetera, et cetera. You have to follow the norms of those groups, right? And so if the other people in your discipline like don't care at all about like the theory and care about XYZ, then they can sometimes they're at odds with each other. So some of this is about changing, how we evaluate faculty and the kind of work that they do, and giving people the space and time to do that work too, because a lot of this stuff isn't going to happen quickly. And I think sometimes people who've been studying racism, even people who've been studying racism and population health, which while it's new, there are people who've been doing this for a long time, some of whom were mentioned in people's presentations, are frustrated because it seems as though some of the scholarship that's coming out is really people who already have sort of the machine of the work that they're doing, and now kind of just like adding like, oh, yay, we just said how, oh, it's great that we're studying structural racism. And it is great, but the other problem is it becomes the new shiny object. And so then there's a lot of like not great work coming out, but people who like know how to speak to their field doing that, and then kind of just disregarding the other things that would make the work stronger. And so anyway, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think some of this is the structure of, the academic process, grant writing process, et cetera. And so there has to be some movement in those areas too, to allow people, so that like people can get trained. They can actually work in interdisciplinary teams and have the time to do that without being scooped or, missing the grant deadline or like not getting tenure. So yeah, that's my comment.
Any other comments on that one?
I'll add that I think, in addition to tenure, promotion, and how that doesn't help things, that even our training. I mean, I guess Dr. Lee's already alluded to this, but we're not trained to be interdisciplinary unless there are certain programs around, but not everyone is able to be in one of those programs. And we're so like, people talk about silos, but we really dig in. Like, I remember before I, sort of opened to the world, I'm new to population health. I've written many papers saying how do we measure structural racism, and this seems, people would ask at conferences, I'd say I don't know. And then as I began reading outside of my discipline, I was like, oh, there may be imperfect measures, but people have ways of thinking about this. And sometimes when we're so like in psychology, we're not, in conversation with other scholars who have a broader lens. So I think that's important. Even our conferences and our meetings tend to be very kind of siloed, and we're not always interfacing with folks who may have a different lens. And so I think that's also an important consideration in thinking about moving the work forward.
So I now want us to think about researcher positionality. So when I'm using the term positionality, I'm thinking about how one's individual identity or their background, how that determines their access to privilege in society. So how do you think should a researcher's positionality matter? And if so, how? And we can, Nate, you can take that one.
I'm sorry, I think just to make sure I understand, when you say positionality,
Yes.
to
So
just
because
clarify?
when I'm using that term positionality, I'm thinking about like as the researcher, how does a researcher's ethnicity, gender, their own sexual orientation, how should that influence the way they approach our work, or should it not matter? Should that not be something we consider and think about in how we conduct our investigations of structural racism?
Yeah, I guess I can give my personal opinion. I'm a difficult person to ask because my training was very much like strict behavioral science. So it was very much like old school experimental psychology. You're separate from the population as much as possible. But I think at the same time, it's very difficult for me to separate the fact that, based on my race and ethnicity, there's a certain connection to the work that I'm doing, and that the way that it's perceived by certain people in the world necessarily directly impacts me. I don't know that I have a good answer as to whether or not it should be or shouldn't be, and maybe that is a question that maybe does need a bit more of an interdisciplinary answer. But I think for me, I think I at least try to keep in mind where I'm at in terms of things. I think that especially in the work of trying to get at this intersection of racial inequity and neuroscience, really trying to understand at least the history of how that's kind of been abused in certain areas, and making sure that, okay, if I say something, is this going to have big impacts on how people view me, at least, as well as the people that look like me, when this comes out. So I think keeping in mind is important, but I don't think my answer is as developed as it could be.
This is definitely like a challenging question. It's a good one that it's good to ask, but in some ways it can be loaded, and just because I think people have the question you asked evokes lots of different ideas, and in my mind I'm thinking like all the ways people can like take this question and twist it. Anyway, but so with that being said, one thing we often don't talk about is the importance of diversity in research, and the reason why is because when we think about diversity in research, I think we often have like specific notions and ideas about what that means from like a DEI lens, et cetera. But from an excellence in research lens, I think it also helps us to understand that we can, if we are more diverse as researchers in general, from all different kinds of perspectives. So not just mine as like a Black Puerto Rican woman, but from all different perspectives, whether it's geographic, et cetera. We ask different questions, and sometimes we push the boundaries of our work. We move forward because we ask different and better questions sometimes too. I remember there was an editor for I was at an event in New York with journalists, and there was an editor there. I think Maggie Hickman was there too, and one of the things that she said was, most journalists are really good. They know how to do the research for asking a question often, but the issue is, are they asking the right question? And the reason why you need diverse editorial boards, diverse other leadership in journalism in terms of representation is to make sure that all the kinds of questions are being answered. And so for me, I think the reason why we need to think about diversity in terms of researchers is because I think it makes the research better. We ask questions we wouldn't ask. It pushes us. It allows for more innovation. And so those are the reasons why I think it's the case. We cannot be a strong field if we don't have diverse scholars asking questions using any of the definitions that you've used before, because we'll keep asking the same questions. We won't be exciting. We won't be doing the things we need to do to actually improve health outcomes, as Dr. Neblett said. So anyway, that's how I answer that.
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues here. I think it's an important consideration. I don't think I would, nor has anyone argued for a kind of essential or absolute idea that, you have to have this, you have to look this way, or your identity in order to do research with a particular group has to be X, right? I do think that people's experiences can enhance the questions and the types of thoughts and innovation and solutions and research approaches, you know, and the ways they think about research. So I think there's value there. And I have to say, because I've, you know, been in the room and reviewed numerous grants where, you know, you have teams, and I'll just be blunt, that are all white teams that don't have expertise, haven't published on the population that they're conducting the research on. And I do think that you have to think about positionality in those such situations. Would I argue that you can't do good, high quality research that's, you know, good science if you are not a racial minority working with a racial minority? No, I wouldn't argue that. But I think having diverse teams and thinking about blind spots, you know, I was just given a presentation on an intervention we're working on in Detroit, and one of my colleagues said, well, have you thought about how gender identity, particularly for trans and also sexual minority individuals, this might be different in terms of workforce training programs. And I hadn't thought about that. And I thought that's an excellent, you know, sort of issue that I should be thinking about and collaborating with people to think about that. So I think it's important to consider, but again, with the caveat that, you know, you don't have to look a certain way. You can have someone who looks like me who may not have had experiences with racism, for example. So, or that's their perception. And so that, you know, would you want to say that that person should be on a researcher just because of how they look? Yeah, so.
Right. Wow, I'll ask one more question before I get
Can I ask
to
you just one thing
yeah.
I would say? Yeah, I would. So one caveat I will make though is I do think that we need to be in whatever position we have, thinking about this positionality too, as a senior scholar, somebody with tenure, without, we need to be thinking about the ways in which racism operates in our institutions, in our disciplines, in our departments, et cetera, and how we interact with individuals. Because as I mentioned before, you know, the questions we ask can be so much better, so much more expanded, like we hit blind spots or open up blind spots, et cetera, but we have to be open to those and see those as important. And I think there's many stories of, you know, graduate students who've talked to faculty members of all races, but who have a particular idea of what meaningful research is in their field, that may be biased. And so I think something that individuals need to revisit and try to understand, especially if you want to do interdisciplinary work. Because again, as we mentioned before, there were individuals sounding the alarm and talking about the ways we needed to connect racism, et cetera, to population health before, you know, we were having, you know, all these hundreds of panels on this, before they were grant calls for this type of work, et cetera. Meaning that, and often those were individuals who were disproportionately, you know, African-American scholars, Latinx scholars, Native, Indigenous scholars, Asian scholars, et cetera, who were doing that work. So I think we should be clear that there are connections here, and so I just want to make sure that I'm laying down my position that this is something that's important to be thinking about. Scholars who were talking about racism were disproportionately scholars of color, and they were asking these kinds of questions, and those questions were being marginalized in certain fields, right? And in population health. So we need to be thinking about these things critically.
Thank you. So one last question before I switch to the audience questions is, what about healing? What about wellness and optimal health functioning? We spent this time thinking about structural racism and its linkages to health, but in what ways can we consider protective factors? And Enrique, I will have you start.
Well, I think from the conceptual models that I showed in my brief presentation, that's something I've thought about for a long time in our work, and that's, you know, thinking about identity, thinking about cultural values that mitigate some of these factors. We've seen a number of so-called paradoxes where it looks like, we get these health effects that we don't expect, and it may be due to social and community context factors that actually bolster health. So I think thinking about cultural values, thinking about familial processes for families where that's important are important ways that we can do that, even as we consider multiple levels of the ecology. One thing I've been thinking about, and I'll add here, is in our work, we've looked mostly at protective factors at the individual level. So things like racial identity and, sort of beliefs about race and things of that nature. One thing I've been increasingly thinking about is how do social and community contexts sort of facilitate those individual characteristics, or what does racial identity look like on a kind of neighborhood or sort of communal level. So we tend to measure resilience as something that's an aspect of the individual, but I think there are also ways that resilience and resistance takes place at a community and neighborhood level. And I'd love to begin to think about how do we measure some of those aspects as well.
Any other thoughts on that one? All right, so we'll switch to the audience questions. This first one is from an audience member who says, I'm curious as to how the speakers navigate how their work may be misinterpreted as the biologizing of race, like in quotes, racial differences in their study of the biologic mechanisms and cultural and structural racism. How do you negotiate the importance of showing the very real biology, the toll of racism on the health that it has on health without reinforcing racial categories? And says, thank you again for this wonderful panel. So if we could, Nate, can you start with that one?
Yeah, happy to do that. So, I struggle with this a lot in terms of, when we first started doing these analyses back in like 2013 of, the sort of purpose of the grant was to understand differences in rates of internalizing disorders between Black and white individuals and trying to understand if there's sort of a neurobiological basis for that. I think that we have a very clear history in psychology and psychiatry of ascribing immutable differences between Black and white individuals to this sort of pseudo idea that there are these immutable brain differences. And so at least in all the work that I've tried to do is really emphasize the more proximal contributions to any differences or race-related variability that we see, and really try to take into account both our ideas and reviewer feedback of how we contextualize that. We don't think that these are essentialist aspects of biology, that we think that these are race-related. They are tied to the necessarily endemic aspects of racialization in the US that's tied to adversity and the other sort of socio-historical aspects that we've talked about. And so when we go about discussing these findings, we always contextualize, what is the history of this adversity, quantifying the amount, to the best statistically that we can, the contributions of the adversity, to these differences, and really framing it into, it's not really race, it's all these other things. And maybe there's a percentage of variance left over, but also we'll usually only measure, 10 variables maximum, and the diversity of experience that Black and white individuals might have and might differ on is so vast and almost unquantifiable in, a single study that there's a lot left to do. So I think that the negotiation I make is we're going to talk about the things that are most proximal, the things that are most modifiable, and the things that we think are having the most direct impact before we start going down the list of, other things that it could be.
What I would add to that, we've had a number of findings that when we get them, we say, oh boy, how are we gonna, put this in the literature in a way that folks aren't gonna, go off in the wrong way. And so one of the ways that we've done that is we kind of are thoughtful about what we anticipate people might say. And when we, as Dr. Harnett has alluded to, discuss the findings, we kind of say, one possible interpretation of this is that, X, Y, and Z. However, here's why we think that that's missing, not the complete picture. And even if it's something we haven't measured in our study, we'll say, these racialized differences or this pattern unexpected finding, here's why we think it's what it is, and then we'll cite other work that lends credence to the idea that there might be alternative explanations. So I think it's one thing if people may draw an incorrect conclusion and you don't address it head on. My approach is to name it, to say what the conclusion may be and why you think it's incorrect, if you can, and support it with evidence, even if not from your own study.
And this is a follow-up question to that question, but it's essentially trying to understand what are the biological mechanisms of adverse effects under chronic stress or repeated exposures to ACEs? So this question is in response to Nate's presentation, where in the example you provided was the snake hiss, which is more like an acute threat. Whereas there's concern about how does chronic stress impact outcomes like brain development or other health outcomes?
Yeah, sorry, I want to make sure I was muted. I think that's a really good question. I think that a lot of what we're trying to look at in terms of contributions to the acute response is the actual chronicity of stress that individuals might be involved in. So the example of the snake hiss is really when we're in the MR environment and trying to do a task-related study, we can't really keep them in the MR for a couple of years and put them through stress that way. We kind of need something that's very quick that we can sort of measure the acute stress response. And the idea being that, if people are exposed to sort of chronic stress at different levels, that should have sort of a linear or nonlinear association with the acute stress response. And so we're really trying to get both to the best that we can. I think that, part of the work in trying to measure, at least for what we did for the Healthy Pastures data, is really trying to look at neighborhood disadvantage, violence exposure, and early life income across development as much as possible. So it's across about a decade or two, similar with ABCD, although it's really hard to tell exactly how far that goes back. But no, I agree that trying to get at the chronicity of stress is also an important aspect in terms of how it might modify people are responding to, what is most pressing for us, a traumatic event.
And so this next question kind of goes back to our conversation around measurement. So in Hetty's presentation, you mentioned using multiple measures of structural racism. Hetty, do you have an example, or anyone, is there an example of using a combination of measures? And then kind of building off that question, have there been any measurement strategies that you think are in particular something that we should try to make sure we move forward on?
So I think there's many examples, or not many, but there are more than a few examples of sort of different kinds of indices that have been used to capture structural racism, and often it depends on the paper, right? Because it depends on what level of aggregation that's being used, et cetera. But they draw upon various types of measures such as racial disparities in unemployment, incarceration, franchise, voting, educational differences. The list continues. So one of the things that I was trying to, a point that I was trying to drive home in my talk was, in addition, I think there's been a lot of focus on thinking about the components of what might go into an index or other sort of, measure. But we need to also be paying attention to the features of racism, however we have decided to define it. And again, I think the point Dr. Neblett makes is really important, which is, we have different disciplinary lenses, but at least from my view as a drawing from sociology, humanistic social sciences and humanities, we know that racism is dynamic. There are ways in which institutions operate together to amplify, replace, et cetera, forms of to amplify and replace each other to create or maintain racial inequality. And so I think thinking through measurement processes and modeling processes that allow for that dynamism and for that ability for and for the dynamism over time, but also dynamism in the configuration of the elements of social and racial control that might be operating in different places and spaces, even in the same time period, are going to be really important. So I mentioned systems modeling, but I think there's just a lot more that could be done as we think through measurement. And I think psychologists have thought a lot about measurement. There are often many measures for like often for like a similar sort of concept or idea. I guess I would say just to ensure that, from my point of view, it's making sure that the theory, whatever that theory is actually being, and first identify what that research is and that it actually is informing your modeling approach. So it can't just be about the measures. And also just thinking through, we're as data science, as individuals who draw from data, we're also limited by data, right? Like you can't keep somebody when you in an MRI for, years, as you mentioned, but similarly, we also, we don't, it's unclear if we we have the universe of variables that would be needed to do the kind of modeling strategies that I'm suggesting right now. And so I think also being clear about that, and when work is being done is also important, right? To be like, this is the, I think anybody who's saying right now, like I have the aces of, structural racism, I wouldn't believe, right? I mean, it's like, don't think we're just at the beginning, right? So people's measures are proxies, and they're very rough proxies. There's a lot more work to be done.
Something I just thought about sitting here is that I've had few conversations with analysts and folks who have quantitative expertise to say, look, you all know a lot about numbers and approaches. I'm not familiar with the systems approach. I've, in some of my prior work, used, things like latent class or latent profile analysis. And they're both, folks who think there's some value in that approach and others who think it's problematic. So I think in this sort of vein that we were talking about earlier of multiple disciplines, interdisciplinary, we also need to, because I'm limited in my statistical and analytic skill set. When I want to do something, I go and I consult, but I wish that there were opportunities for folks who have the numbers expertise, quantitative, that's what they do, to sit down at the table with folks and say, here's what we have. You all know the numbers. How can we partner and figure out the best ways, cutting edge ways to capture this?
Well, you actually got on the last question that I wanted to ask you all, is just if you have any suggestions on how we can create interdisciplinary spaces to break down the disciplinary silos. Any thoughts?
You're doing it right now. Yeah, I mean, I think, organizations like IAPHS do a lot of that kind of work. We're bringing individuals across disciplines together I think even training programs, there can be more. I think there's ways that training programs are becoming more purposeful in other areas, in terms of thinking about, a capital T in training, interdisciplinary across, what does that really look like? And I think there's a lot of work being done across different fields, maybe not necessarily integrating sociology in some fields, but others. And so I think we can draw from those kinds of, programs to help inform our work, and then providing opportunities for and funding, et cetera, for individuals to be able to get together and do this too. Because so much of it is about time and money. Yeah, I don't know. Anybody else want to say something? I know we're close to the end.
Yes, yeah. So we are close to the end, but I think we have just we can quickly, if you all just have last words that you just want to depart before we wrap up, and we can start. Nate, do you want to start if you have any last words?
In the last like 10 seconds. I really appreciate you guys having me today, and being able to share some of this information and hear sort of your guys' expert opinion and have these really important conversations. I think, as was mentioned, as we move forward, trying to get an actual real understanding of these processes, trying to at least, if one person can't be the interdisciplinary master, figuring out how we develop teams that are going to be able to answer some of these really complex questions is important.
So nothing profound. I'll just pick up with the last question for my last bit, and that is, I have a lab group. I don't know if interdisciplinary is going too far, but I have public health students, which is interdisciplinary of itself, and I also have psychology students in my lab. So, it's really exciting to have the different lenses, their different trainings, and have them in the same space, kind of figuring things out together, I think is a way. And I would encourage, I think there are probably many students on the call to, kind of put yourselves in situations. I'm doing a lot of community-based work now. I have psychology students who don't have that training, so they sit in on meetings that I'm having with community partners. They're sitting in on the lab meetings, and just, putting yourself in places where you can learn different lenses, and different ways that people are talking about things, I think is a way to expand the training. You've got to be innovative and creative about how you get those opportunities. Thanks for having me. This was great.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'd also say just continue to read outside of your discipline, even if you don't know if it's going to inform your research. Like read racecraft or just read literature. I'm not saying you're not doing that, but if you do, there's so much we need to learn about the world, even if it's never going to directly inform our research question. They can just help us be better researchers and humans. So just, read broadly. Don't just read all the, journal articles, be expansive and like learn about the history of our country and, what people in philosophy say and how writers are talking about the experience, the Black experience, the Latinx experience. It goes a long way to inform our work.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists. This has been just an amazing conversation. I am just, glad it's recorded. Probably going to go back and watch it again. But this concludes our Racism Lab Symposia. So again, thank you to our panelists, but also thank you. You can't see her, but she's right here. Thank you to Dr. Margaret Hicken for your exceptional leadership. This has been just a wonderful symposium that is like, I've learned so much. And as we've seen here, we've gotten to like collaborate and like cultivate new ways of thinking. Thank you to all the Racism Lab members. This is just wonderful and looking forward to next year. So with that, thank you.